Welcome to Fear Street.
This took place a few years ago in South Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. Here in Louisiana, we call counties parishes, in case you didn't know. I was hunting deer and wild pigs one night on a protection levee system that was built to protect the town from hurricane floodwaters. As I walked to where the levee turns off to the left, there was a canal through the woods that was about 100 yards away from some houses. To the left was a natural ridge that goes out into swamps and marshes. Well, as I made that turn from the ridge of oak trees, I heard a growl. I thought it might have been a coyote or dog, so I walked slower. Then, I heard brush and a smaller sized tree shake, and another growl. I shined my light in the direction of the sound and saw a pair of eyes that were reflecting an amber yellow color. What surprised me was the fact that the brush was about 6 foot high and the eyes were about a foot above it. When I saw those eyes, I slowly backed up while keeping my light on the bushes. As I walked back to the turn to head back to my truck, which was parked about 3/4 of a mile away, it came out of the woods. I lit the thing up with my light again. Now, I was probably 30 feet away from it. I saw its whole body and face. The body was covered with black hair with some brown mixed in. The hair was thickest around its head, neck, chest, and upper back. It looked a lot like a lion's mane, but wasn't as pronounced since all of the hair was the same color. It had pointy ears, with a little bit of hair coming off the points, making them seem a little longer. It stood on 2 legs, but the legs were weird and backward-like. The arms were really long, longer than the legs. Its hands were like a mixture of human and bear, like really big raccoon front paws. It had paws, but it also had fingers. That's the only way I can describe it. If you watch the movie The Howling, you'll get an idea what this thing looked like. It's as if whoever made the movie knew something others didn't. Now at this point, I was freaking out, so I pulled up my rifle. I hunt with a Romanian AK with a camo paint job. I did it myself. The way I was hunting wasn't exactly legal. That's why I took my Romanian AK. If I had to toss it, I wouldn't be out much money. The rounds I use are special rounds, made to hunt feral hogs. I've dropped deer and hogs with these rounds before. 1 shot and they're done. But back to the story. As I pulled my rifle up, to the ready, it growled and walked a few steps toward me. I fired a round right into its chest area. I knew I hit it, because the creature took a step back. As it stepped back, I ran toward my truck. That's when it let out a loud growl and a howl like I'd never heard before. I grew up hunting and fishing, and I thought I knew everything in the woods, but I hadn't heard anything like the sounds it made before. As I ran back to the truck, it stalked me, but kept its distance. As I got close to the well-lit area where my truck was parked, by the town library and elementary school, it stopped following me. I tried to find anyone who may have had similar encounters in the area, but all I could find was old legends of the Rougarou. I told my grandpa about what had happened, but told him it was a friend who told me it happened to him. I also told him that it sounded like a crazy story to me. He told me that when he was 17, in the same area, at night hunting, he heard a howl like nothing he'd ever heard before. He also told me that something had stalked him as he ran home that night. He said he never saw what it was, but could hear it following him through the brush and swamps. That encounter has changed my life. My perception of what's real and what's not will never be the same again. I still haven't gotten over that night. I went back a few days after that incident and found 2 large dog tracks, as big as my hand. I wear a size large glove. I was 14 years old and lived in central Louisiana at this time. My mother had always been interested in the paranormal. She'd buy copies of UFO magazine and watch documentaries on Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, so I grew up being interested in things like that, at face value. I always believed in them, but I never had any inkling that werewolves, dogmen, or whatever could possibly exist. Anyway, I lived in a mobile home park, which was on a 2-lane highway. Highway 28 East, to be exact. It was a long street with a cul-de-sac type of dead end. At the dead end, to the left was the only brick home in the park. Straight ahead was thin woods and several trails going off in every direction. To the right, slightly, was a deep ditch that people had dumped junk and trash in, like old washing machines, broken laundry baskets, or what have you. A thin metal wire fence ran from the ditch across to the woods and out of sight. We, the kids in the neighborhood, had what we called a club, where we'd all gather to hang out. Some of us had gathered busted or discarded dining room chairs and placed them in the center of what was the thinnest area of trees. I had come there to figure out where to put everything. Beyond the deep ditch, further into the woods, was a small stream with hills on each side. An enormous old oak tree had fallen beside the stream on the side I was on. I spotted an old metal folding table near the stream and went down to inspect it. I thought it would be a good item to put in the center of the chairs. It seemed to be in good condition, so I decided to head home. I figured I'd get it the next morning. The next morning, I made my way toward the metal wire fence, which somehow, I don't know why, had been bent on both its top and bottom. It was bent inward toward the center of the fence. I was about to duck under it when I heard the distinct sound of sniffing, so I turned to see what it was. Standing on the other side of the stream was a 7 to 8 foot tall creature, sniffing the air. Its head was turned slightly. The first thought that entered my mind was, oh my God, werewolves are real. It stood on 2 powerfully built, muscular legs, which ended in enormous paws. It had no tail. It had a massive chest, as well as extremely muscular arms and hands. The hands seemed to have the same kind of pads that a paw has, but they were arranged differently. It had a wolf-like head and tall pointed ears. The eyes glowed red. The ears were in proportion to the head. It had a snout or muzzle. It kept sniffing the air as it stepped over the tree trunk like it was nothing. I would have had to physically climb it to get over it. I thought it was coming after me. It stopped and seemed to be breathing or panting, but there was this deep rumble that accompanied it. I decided to get out of there before it did see me and ducked up under the fence. I ran to my bike, which was parked off the road, and pedaled my butt home. I never went into those woods again after that. About 1.5 to 2 months later, we moved to Mississippi. It wasn't until many years after that I discovered the term dogman. It scared me, but also started me on my fascination with ancient myths, legends, werewolves, and many other non-Bigfoot cryptids. I'd been living in my first apartment for a year or two when there was a blackout one night at about 9 p.m. My apartment was small and hot, so my roommate and I decided to go outside for a walk. She lived in the area with her family for some years, so she was familiar with it. She told me there was a project area we could walk through and circle back around to get back to the apartment building. We walked about 2 blocks and reached the bottom of the hill that led to the projects. The project area still had street lamps that shined on the sidewalk, allowing you to see. As we started walking up the sidewalk, I could see something up ahead about 20 feet that looked odd. I could see a pair of white legs, about 3 feet tall, moving stiff and very fast. For a second I thought it was a kid. Then I realized that it couldn't be a kid by himself at this time of night. It was about 9:30 by now. So as I began to try to figure out what it was I was looking at, I noticed that there was a body on top of the legs. It was black and camouflaged. I could barely see it, but I could see the top of the ears, and it had to be standing about 10 feet tall. I could tell the arms looked bent, and it was walking quickly, like it had somewhere to go. I don't know why we didn't turn around, but I guess we felt more comfortable being behind it than it being behind us. There was a guy coming down the opposite left-hand sidewalk of the projects, and we were walking on the right side. I thought that this guy must be seeing this thing, but I'm not sure he did because his body language didn't change. It crossed the street toward him and disappeared between the parked cars. I was trying to figure out how such a massive animal could just disappear. As we walked by the parked vehicles about 2 to 5 feet from us, I could see something out of my peripheral vision, and I just had to look. When I did, I saw these black eyes staring at me, as big and black as horse eyes, and I could see the pointy ears were so tall, like a German shepherd, but much taller. I could see that the nose was long, like a Doberman, but longer, and it was dark black, like outer space black. The best way to describe it to this day is the Anubis character. It was hiding its arms by folding them under itself, but the elbows were still sticking out, and I could see the pointy black hairs coming off of them. It had its legs tucked under the parked cars, and I didn't feel comfortable taking my eyes off of its eyes to look because it seemed intelligent, like its moves were calculated and quick. It just watched us walk by calmly, kind of like a cat does. We turned the corner and got the heck out of there. This took place in Chicopee, Massachusetts, in an area called the Chicopee Center, and there are woods behind the project area that led to the highway. One morning, around 6 a.m. about 2 years ago, I was living close to Washington, D.C. A friend of a friend needed a roommate to afford the rent for an apartment he had found. So when I was told about this, my first thought was, here's my chance to move out of my parents' house. After about 6 months of living in the area, I noticed that on certain nights, I'd hear loud roars in the distance. I could never tell how far away the noise was coming from. It would sometimes sound nearby, or just far enough away where I wouldn't mind being outside to see what might be making the sound from a safe distance. Although it was a quiet, wooded area, it was actually pretty heavily populated because it was only 5 minutes away from the University of Maryland. One morning, around 6 a.m., I just snapped awake from a deep sound sleep for no reason at all. I started to go back to sleep but thought to myself, why am I wide awake and alert? It was strange. I was completely awake. Then, right in my backyard, I heard a low, deep growl. That's when I knew something was up. The moment I heard that, I knew. That was why I woke up. I remained quiet and didn't move for the next 5 to 10 minutes, as this thing started to become very active in my backyard. It went from the low growls to heavy breathing. This thing's lungs had to be massive, because it sounded the same exact way a horse would if you were standing right next to it. When it breathed through its nose, it sounded more like a horse, only much more aggressive. Obviously, I knew it wasn't a horse in my backyard. That wouldn't be possible, but what I saw was very real. It ran from my backyard into my neighbor's, and then back and forth, again and again. It made no sense for it to be doing that. It would stop and sniff around, and then sneeze very loudly. It sounded like it was right next to my window, and I was on the second floor. I didn't want to look out the window because I was too scared. I thought, this thing must be trying to get my attention on purpose. I stayed in bed, frozen. I was beyond scared. I really thought it was a werewolf, even before I saw it. The guys that lived below me started yelling and screaming El Diablo over and over. I could hear it leaving the backyard, so I hurried to try and get a look. When I did, all I saw was its backside. This thing was massive, with broad shoulders like a bodybuilder, and its ears were sticking up on its head. It slowly walked away until I lost sight of it.